So the topic today is for AI off the record, and that's because in recent conversations with RIM practitioners, there's been a lot of concern about AI's impact on governance, ranging from why should I even care about this, to how will AI impact the role of RIM? Will it actually obsolesce the need for RIM? And how can RIM enable AI? And there's some good news and bad news depending how you look at it. So today we'll discuss some of the examples that we're seeing at the world's largest organizations. My name is James Sommermann, ZL Technologies, and we help many of the world's largest companies manage all of their unstructured data, particularly when there's a lot of data and not much leeway for mistakes. So as we know, RIM is particularly focused on unstructured data, all the documents, files, electronic communications around the company. And we take that for granted, but the reality is, in most parts of the organization, they've been highly focused on structured data for decades and decades, and almost ignored all of the unstructured data. The thing about all of this unstructured data is it has one thing in common: created by humans for other humans. And thus, it reflects a side of the company that very few people have had access to. And that's precisely what makes it so valuable for artificial intelligence to learn from. It has the sentiment, the intent, the dynamics, the communications of the company, which makes it a goldmine for AI if harnessed and managed. There are some problems with this, which is that today there are no guardrails for AI to access all of this data. And that's what we're going to address today. So whether we like it or not, RIM and AI are on a collision course, collision, convergence, however you want to see it, but it's primarily in two different points. One is that AI craves business records because they reveal all the decision points of the company. That's something that AI has not had access to in the past. So RIM will need to be able to curate and feed just the relevant business records into AI. The second piece, RIM enabling AI. AI will need to enable RIM because the biggest bottleneck today in RIM is the classification of data. So as RIM has scaled from managing just business records to managing everything, we've relied on a few different tactics to help us scale. One is relying on information owners to classify their own data. So at large companies, we'll see thousands of people in the company actually classifying data. And that has helped, but the problem with it is, one of the problems, they all apply rules a little bit differently. You can set the guidelines all you want. Each of them will interpret them differently. It's the same reason why someone gave me this example, but I liked it quite a bit. Despite having the same exact traffic laws as every other city in the country, in most cities, you use your turn signal before you change lanes. In New York, you do that, no one's gonna let you change lanes. You get punished for it. Same rules, different behavior. So RIM enables AI, and we're starting to see if AI can indeed enable RIM. Now, the thing with AI, it's not just about business records. There's everything else that is ushering in to the spotlight with AI. Although records has started to scale to managing things outside of typical business records, that is going to be accelerated dramatically. Why? Because AI is pointing the spotlight on parts of the company that have been completely dark until now. There's all of the personal data that's lying there. There's rot, things that should have been deleted in the past. Maybe we were kind of able to ignore it before. Now, as AI starts wanting to ingest more and more, we can't really ignore it. And this data needs a lot of care. The same thing that makes it highly, highly impactful is the same thing that makes it sensitive. And some would probably even say radioactive, because if you don't manage it, this data is a ticking time bomb. It's why whenever there's a crisis or scandal, where's the first place we look? Unstructured data. For example, the January 6th insurrection, where did we look? Secret Service text messages. Anytime there's a high-profile breach, typically we find out there was a good deal of unstructured data involved. And the sad thing is, it's mostly data that we could have actually deleted. Typically, what ends up leaking is data from years ago, and if there was some mechanism to actually clean up data over time, it wouldn't have been an issue. But the reality is, outside of the RIM function, very few in the organization are equipped to handle unstructured data. And until recently, many of them didn't even see it as actual data, right? Oh man, this is where I had some pretty killer jokes, but I was advised against it. So I want to take a look at the paradigm today and the paradigm moving forward. So structured data, it's been pretty simple. And this is what companies have been dealing with for decades and decades. When you want to process and analyze it, what do? You create a copy of it, you put it in some type of data lake. Data lake, data repository, data warehouse, whatever the case, we see players like Snowflake and Databricks popping up. And that has worked quite well. For unstructured data, it doesn't quite work that way. So unstructured data typically is much larger. It's usually about 80% of all of the company's data. And the last thing you want to do with that is create a copy of it, move it into some repository if you don't have to. One, the storage costs alone will end up surpassing probably tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars for large companies. Two, this data, because it's so sensitive, you really don't want to create more copies than you have to. And taking 100% of all of this data, putting it into a data lake or data repository for processing isn't going to fly. You can ask your general counsel. They'll probably advise against it. So this is the paradigm. Typically, about 2% of all of unstructured data actually needs to be copied and preserved. This is your high-value business records. This is data that you really want to lock down and make sure it's not deleted. But what about the other 98%? Do we just ignore it? Today, really, we can't. We don't want to create a copy of it, but I don't think we can ignore it. The first thing is privacy regulations like GDPR, CCPA. They say that no matter where personal data lies, you need to be able to find it and remediate it. Whether that's producing it for a subject access request or deleting it. But that personal data can be lying anywhere. It's not necessarily in a business record. It could be in a text message. If you have to find it, today, for the most part, there's not a capability to do that. The second piece, as I mentioned, AI and analytics, they want to get their hands on as much relevant information as they can, and that can be anywhere. So you have to be able to scrape through this entire beach of data and find just the relevant information to feed for AI and for analytics. The third piece, the over-retention risks. Not just the cybersecurity breaches, but also litigation. A lot of times companies end up in court and they have to produce data that they probably could have deleted 5 years ago, but they have it, they have to produce it, it ends up being incriminating. So preserving data longer than you have to has clear over-retention risks. So it's no longer an option to just ignore the other 98% of data. Whether you're thinking about using it for AI and for analytics, or whether you're just thinking about information governance, you can't ignore it. The path forward is to manage it virtually, which means you extract all of the intelligence, all of the content, all of the metadata from all of this information without copying the document itself. You're still able to search across all of it. You're still able to take action on the data, apply lifecycle management, but without copying the document. There's really not a need for archiving most data. Now, there's also the governance functions which companies are responsible for. And today, for the most part, they operate independently from one another. You have your archive, potentially for regulatory compliance or for e-discovery. You have your document management system for records management. You have various repositories for actually managing data that you want to take special care with. The problem is, because they're independent from one another, you can never truly manage it holistically. In privacy, if you're asked to find and delete personal data, can you just go ahead and delete it? Well, no. First, you have to check to make sure it's not being retained as a business record. You have to make sure that it's not being preserved for e-discovery, that it's not part of some regulatory investigation. So inherently, each of these functions need to communicate closely together. And that is the problem when you have them as independent silos. Now throw in the fact that you actually want to start using this data for AI. Well, have you actually checked it against each of your governance functions to make sure that that's possible? The path forward likely is to unify each of these functions, apply them at the source rather than create another repository to manage each of them. So we've talked a lot about how to manage this data, but let's talk about the insights that you actually get from it. So 80% of our time, by and large, is spent doing what? Communicating, sharing information, talking with our employees or with customers as a company. And most of that today is virtual. So you can think of this as an aspect that has been completely invisible from corporate view until now. But every aspect of influence, of leadership, of intent, of communication, of sentiment is buried in this data. And in a minute, I'll give some examples of how companies are actually using it to get insights. But this is the part where people start usually getting kind of queasy about privacy, specifically people from Europe usually, because they have the strictest requirements. And, oh, can we actually do that? Is that ethical? Regardless of what your position on using this information for training AI, for feeding into analytics, for analyzing our workforce, doesn't really matter. Your company will have some stance on privacy for that data. Regardless of what it is, you need the mechanism to be able to turn that privacy knob forward or backwards. Because AI is coming for this data, do you have the mechanism to actually control how data is used and for what? So whether if you agree with the use cases that I'm about to go into, whichever ones you want to do, whichever one your company actually implement, you need some control over the data and you need that privacy knob. So here's the use cases that we've seen pop up in the first 2 years. They range across really every single department in the company, all the way from in sales, trying to figure out who has the best relationship with a large customer to put on a project, who has the warmest touch with them. And in HR, where a lot of companies are trying to figure out who are our subject matter experts on a particular topic, so that when a project comes up, we can understand who to put on that project. Based on all of the communications around the company, who is getting asked questions about this product? Who's the expert in the company? A lot of times, that's not on the org chart. Someone coined the TSTP as the same 10 people who get all the work done in every single department. Can you identify those people before they think about leaving? And make sure you keep them. And this one's actually kind of scary. Can you figure out who's likely to quit before they even consider it themselves? And most of the time, the answer is actually, yeah, you can. Because we typically exhibit at least 12 different patterns before we even think about quitting ourselves. Your latency of responses starts going up. The quality of your responses starts going low. And regardless of what a company wants to do with that, some companies actually do want to use that and see if they can intervene with those employees that are key people that they want to keep while they still have a chance of having that conversation. So putting the ethics of it to the side, more and more of these use cases are popping up. There needs to be a mechanism controlling what data gets used, whatever your company's stance on it is. So one of the insights we picked up as this has been implemented is as you start accessing more and more data, the first thing is expected. You start incrementally getting more and more value from that data. But the funny thing is what happens when you start approaching 95, 99, 100% of all that data. And the value you get from it actually increases exponentially. The reason for that is you can start making deductions based on information that is missing. You have all of the data, so if something's missing, you know that it's missing. The closest analogy I can draw is Sherlock Holmes, the dog that did not bark. And because he knew that every single day the dog was barking at the exact same time, he was able to see the one day that it didn't bark, something was amiss. If you don't have all the data, you can't see the exceptions. It could just be you're missing information. If you have all the data, you know when something is missing. So when you actually stand this up, this is what it looks like. And so we have all of the different repositories of unstructured data growing across the company. Today, most of them are silos. You might say, okay, well, most of our data is in Microsoft. For some companies, that's the case. But even within Microsoft, what you have is thousands and thousands of different repositories that are essentially silos. Our inboxes, they're a silo because they're indexed separately. Each SharePoint site indexed separately. So architecturally, every repository you have, whether it's in Microsoft or not, is a silo. And together, we've tried to stitch them together to actually manage across all of them. The problem is, for many, many years, we've done a much better job of accumulating data than we have of actually getting rid of it. And so what we have are these massive volumes of data that we don't really know what's in there. Some of it goes back decades, and we've been cautious about deleting it because of the risks of getting rid of something that we actually need, right? You don't want to end up in court and say, okay, well, we're supposed to have these documents, we don't, and have some type of spoliation. But those risks of over-retaining information are starting to creep up and surpass the risks of deleting information. It's no longer an option just to let it sit. So not only do we need deletion, what we really need is defensible deletion. Defensible deletion means if you end up in court and have to explain why data is deleted, you can do so defensively. And really, there's three pieces to it. One, you have a policy that is aligned with each of your governance functions, which means you have your records management, your e-discovery, your compliance. You've taken their policies and integrated them into one unified set of policies. You consistently apply this over time. So you don't just wake up one morning and decide we're going to delete 10 million documents. Rather, every single week, you have a report of documents that are eligible for deletion, no matter where they are, based on each of your policies. And once you actually delete them, you have the audit trails to show why that data was deleted, so you can explain that to a judge, a litigator, whatever the case is. And we first stood a system like this up approximately 8 years ago for one of the world's largest banks. They had about 50,000 file servers around the globe. They didn't know what was in there. All they knew was they had about 8 petabytes of data there. So when they came to us, they said, okay, first, we just want to understand what we have. Where is there PII? Where are there actually business records that maybe we didn't classify? Where's there rot that we can get rid of? Second, we want to start cleaning up this data over time. We need the lifecycle management on the source so that this data doesn't keep growing. Third, we have information owners in each of these regions who are responsible for that data. They need a view of just the information they're responsible for so that they can approve the disposition of it. Okay? But we also need the unified view of everything. So we have a global view of everything that's happening no matter what region it's in. Each of them has different requirements, different regulatory requirements, but we need the global view. And the last thing is we want to do it without creating a single copy of any data. So we stood that up, and it's been running for quite a while. They're able to delete, I think, about 10 or 11 million documents a month. And we've since replicated that a few times for other companies. So that's the type of system that we see actually curating data over time to make sure that you're not keeping rot longer than you have to. Once you have that, you actually have the first step to starting to curate data for AI and for analytics. So today you have the different repositories popping up that companies want to feed to train AI. And we're seeing companies move away from the model of having one monolithic LLM towards having various, what they call SLMs, around the company for very specific use cases, each with very specific needs for data. So what we need is the system to classify information as it's created and channel it to these different repositories. One might be on a particular product that the company has, all the manuals and information related to that product. Maybe all of the HR information around the company, they're training an AI on that. But usually the larger companies are having dozens, if not hundreds, of these SLMs that they're starting to train, each with different data requirements. So if you have the governance guardrails built into data, it's not being kept longer than it needs to be, it's being classified based on what's in it. That is the first step to actually feeding data to the right place. You still need the ability to wrangle all of this information for relevant information, extract just the intelligence from it, and feed that into these different repositories, and preferably doing so without copying the document itself. So can you extract just the intelligence, leave the document at the source, and feed that intelligence? And then the final piece that's coming into play, and I'll be honest, this is a work in progress. Can we actually use AI to start classifying documents? Because like I said, there's a pretty big bottleneck in the classification of data at the enterprise scale. And AI is getting more and more successful at doing this. There's still some concerns about the accuracy, although there's concerns about accuracy even when humans do it. So you got to take that with a grain of salt. So a system like this, really there's 4 capabilities that you need to stand it up. 1, you need to be able to manage the entire beach of data rather than just creating more and more sandboxes. Wherever the data is created, you need to be able to manage it. Second, can you manage it virtually? The data stays at its location. You just extract what you really need without copying the document itself. In doing that, you typically cut your storage costs by up to 90%. You also minimize the risks of having more and more duplicates pop up around the organization. Can you apply unified governance to this data? Not more and more repositories with different governance functions, one system that communicates with each of the functions, so anytime you want to take an action, for example, in records management, you have instant feedback from the other functions. When you stand up those 3, this 4th one may sound far-fetched, so let me explain. You actually accelerate your speed to data, your speed to AI by over 1,000 times, and it can be much more than that. And usually when you explain that, people have a reaction to it. But the reality is, if you're relying on the source system where data is created to get documents out for AI, let's take Microsoft for example. 1, you're waiting on Microsoft to find you the right information, to actually apply the search, whether it can find you the precise information or not. Assuming that it eventually does. Now you have to wait for Microsoft to actually export, let's say 10 million documents. It doesn't usually do that quickly. There's quite a bit of throttling involved, costs, and sometimes both. Either way, you're waiting for Microsoft to send you those 10 million documents. Let's say you review them and you decide you need to change your search a little bit, you need to change your parameters a little bit. Now you have to go back and do the same thing over and over. So it's taking you weeks to get to data. If you have that, just the intelligence already extracted that you're able to cut through and wrangle, you have it nearly instantaneously. It's near real time versus waiting for Microsoft. So Microsoft already has the vision, we can say, for the value of this data. And I think Satya Nadella has seen this for the last few years. He said, I've always felt that the biggest or most strategic database in the company is the knowledge repository of all communications within the enterprise. And he's absolutely right about that. But the problem is the actual vision is quite a bit more difficult when you try to go to execute it. And that's because you really can't design for everything. You can design the world's best passenger car, which you could say Microsoft has. When you try to scale to mass transit, it's a whole other set of architectural challenges. And I think, like they say in econ, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. This is absolutely the case. You can't have both. So, years ago, they started by designing a user productivity system. It enables us as employees to be highly, highly productive. They've scaled to what you could call departmental collaboration. So with SharePoint and Teams, now departments are able to collaborate pretty effectively. The question is, does that scale to enterprise-wide governance? Because if you actually look under the hood, what you have, as I mentioned before, thousands and thousands of indexes. Anytime you want to do a search or take a governance action across the entire enterprise, you are stitching together thousands and thousands of indexes, swapping them in, swapping them out. We'll see if that scales. So just to give a few examples of where we see that breaking down, I think a lot of you have probably encountered this as much as we have, but it starts to get pretty bumpy. And one example popped up a couple years ago with one of our clients where it's literally the search ability, the ability to wrangle data based on a very targeted and complex search. It doesn't seem to be capable of that, and I don't think that's an easy fix. So we start to see limitations manifesting at the enterprise scale. So if I can summarize this just pretty quickly for your understanding. So one, we're seeing a demand from IT, the CTO, CDO. They need more relevant information, but there's just too much information out there. To be honest, most of it's junk. Can we cut through all the relevant, just to find the relevant information, no matter where it is, cut through the noise? Because we have these SLMs popping up, each of them needs specific data. I don't think they realize today that this is actually a RIM function. I don't think we've realized it. But the ability to classify data and feed just the relevant information is something that it's a RIM principle. Two, too much data to store. Are we able to manage data virtually? IT will bring in the paradigm of having a data lake. They're not aware of the challenges of managing unstructured data. Again, these are RIM principles of managing data that IT is a little bit late to the party on. And then the third piece, there's so much data out there. We have each of these governance functions. And the problem is, today, AI doesn't really forget. So you want to be very careful about what data you feed into AI. Once you train it, it's very difficult to untrain it. So there needs to be unified governance on the data before it goes in for your use to actually be defensible. And these are, again, RIM functions. I don't think the CDO or IT really knows where to find these capabilities. When you put them all together, these are capabilities that have impact all the way up to the C-suite, all the way to the board of directors. They're all looking for these capabilities. Again, there's very little understanding where to find them. So I think we have to be champions on how these capabilities can be implemented. So just to confuse you, if I can throw this all on one slide to see how it actually looks in practice. At the top, you have your source layer of all of the data being created, literally thousands or tens of thousands of different repositories. When we ingest it, what do we need to do? We have to look into the metadata, we have to look into the content, and use that information to make decisions on how to classify it. There might be some component of user classification. We also have to augment it with auto classification. So we're using some rules to classify this data as it's created. I don't think there's another way of scaling without doing that. This is also the point where we extract just the essence, just the intelligence of every single document so that we're able to search across it. We've indexed it so we can search. We have the content, we have the metadata. We can look at any document we want without going to the source. And this is actually where you would start training an AI model to start classifying data on its own as well. So there's really three ways to classify. There's based on users doing it themselves. There's auto classification based on rules that you've set. And then there's AI learning from those rules, learning from how users classify data to expand and do it on its own. This is the part where it still needs some more work, but some companies are implementing this. Once you have all of this data, once you have the intelligence extracted, you need the ability to search across all of it, wrangle just the relevant information. So that's a global search capability, performing quite complex, quite targeted searches across all of this data, be able to rank and sort it by relevance based on what's actually in it, to cull it down more and more, so going from 10 million documents to 10,000 documents, to feed just that into your various channels. And that can be training an AI, it can be an e-discovery search, an investigation, or in government, a FOIA request. But there's many, many needs to be able to search, wrangle information, feed just the intelligence. If you need to go back and get the original document later in time, you can do that, right? You can link to the original to pull that out. But until you really need it, it's better not to duplicate data. So I think these capabilities are all built on RIM principles, whether most of the company knows it or not. And I think the road ahead for RIM is quite bright if we choose to embrace it. And I think it's time that we do so. So with that, I will conclude and see if there's any questions. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
Anything that used to be in a library is sort of fallen under records. Does what you're describing allow us to separate records from library again, or is that one more nail in the coffin of the library?
No, I think there's still a need for the library itself, but the library has two parts to it. There's the part with all the data that you make sure never burns down, right? This is the library that you actually secure and you don't let anybody into unless they have the right access to. There's the rest of the library that individuals build on themselves. We as knowledge workers all build our own libraries. Can you try to control every single little library? I don't think you can, to the degree of stopping it from getting deleted. You can put in place the controls to extract intelligence from it all, but I still think you're going to have various libraries around the company. The best you can do is try to extract intelligence from each of them. Sometimes those libraries are going to burn down, but I don't know if there's anything you can do about that. All right. Well, any other questions, you guys can stop by our booth or feel free to shoot me an email. Appreciate the time. Thank you.